Hi, it's Mark Bossert from Top Local Lead Generation. We're here talking with Paul Toffoli, uh, one of the best realtors in Vancouver. He's been voted that for the last 4 or 5 years by his customers, top realtor in Vancouver. You can reach Paul at toffoli.ca. How are you doing today, Paul?
I'm great, Mark.
So today I guess we're going to talk about oil tanks. So what's so dangerous about an oil tank buried in your yard?
So you would think there would be nothing really dangerous about an oil tank buried in your yard. However, there is a risk of environmental contamination. And what that means to the normal homeowner is there's a risk of a cost. Um, in the last sort of 10, 15 years, provincial regulations have come into effect that make it a legal requirement under the BC Fire Code and under the environmental protection regulations that any oil tank that is found is required to be removed prior to the sale of a property. So you can see that if you're buying a property, it would be important to discover whether or not there's an oil tank on the property before you buy, so that you're not taking on the responsibility of removing it. And if you're a seller, you don't want to have that oil tank be a surprise when you've got the accepted offer and you've already negotiated all the terms, and then all of a sudden the buyer comes to you and says, hey, there's an oil tank on your property. I'm not going to go through with this deal, or you have to remove it. Um, and what is the risk financially? Well, best case scenario, talking $5,000 to $6,000 if they find no contamination. Worst case scenario, the worst one I've ever heard of, and this is sort of through the grapevine and through building inspectors I've spoken with, was over $300,000, and that was in West Vancouver, where oil had underground gone through 3 or 4 different properties on a steep slope. So the risks are huge from a financial perspective. And your average cost, I've personally had clients involved on the buying side where they were prospective buyers and they discovered oil tanks on the inspection and had requested the seller to remove. And what we heard back from the seller when it was all done and they'd had all the environmental testing done and it was a clean property, it was upwards of $50,000 just on a basic one. So it's a huge financial risk.
So how do you, with somebody buying a piece of property, how do they find an oil tank is on that potential purchase?
Sure. So what we do two things to protect our clients. First is in the offer, and this is on single-family homes or standalone properties. We're not dealing with stratas and so forth in this situation. But the first thing we do is we put a clause in the offer that says that clarifies that any oil tank found will be removed at the expense of the seller, and that they will be responsible for any environmental cleanup. That's number one. And number two, as part of the inspection, and we also have it subject to inspection. And as part of the inspection process, we have an oil tank specialist come in. They bring in a piece of equipment, usually a very accurate metal detector, and they will scan the property with the metal detector. They can also go to city records and see if any oil tanks have been removed previously, or if there's any records of oil tanks. And finally, if say there's a big concrete slab in the backyard or something like that, there is ground penetrating radar that can be brought in. Usually, to scan just with the metal detector is a nominal fee. Some of the contractors will do it for free because they're hoping to find an oil tank that then they can get a chance to remove. The ground penetrating radar, I think the last time we had a client do it was around a $400 cost. That's probably the most certain way because you can see what's underneath the ground.
So is this a fairly common thing in Vancouver?
It's very common. So many of the homes in Vancouver were built prior to 1960 or 1965 when natural gas started to be sort of the norm. And so what we saw is, first of all, it was coal in the early 1900s, and then those got converted to oil tanks. Um, they buried all those oil tanks in the early days, and then what would often happen is when that oil tank reached the end of its life, they wouldn't remove it. They may fill it with sand or maybe decommission it another way, or they may just leave it, and then they would put an above ground oil tank in place because it was cheaper and easier to put an above ground one in. And so even where sometimes there's been an above ground one, they say there's no problem, there may be an older below ground one that would be discovered. Anything up to homes built probably in the 60s or 70s, there's a risk of an oil tank, and even then it's always a good idea to have it scanned. And what I tell my living clients is, let's get it pre-scanned as part of our pre-listing due diligence, as part of our pre-listing work that we do. We have someone come in, scan it. If there is no oil tank, we get a certificate stating there's no oil tank. We can give that to any potential buyers. It puts their mind at ease. They're not as concerned about it, so it opens the door for more buyers. And if there is an oil tank, you can deal with it before it lists, before you have the potential offer coming in and then getting messed up by an oil tank being there.
So what else is there to be aware of around oil tanks?
I think those are the main factors. Just that it is the law that sellers are responsible to remove them, and that there's a huge financial risk, and they're just best to deal with it ahead of time. And of course, it is always possible that an oil tank has been removed and there may be contamination that hasn't been dealt with, but that's a lot harder to find, and it usually doesn't come to the surface or come into play. But there are also companies out there that will take soil samples and will test to see if there's any hydrocarbon residue in the soil. And that is actually the part of the process when you have a licensed contractor come in to remove an oil tank. They are required by the bylaws to not only remove the tank, but to take soil samples surrounding the tank by a qualified environmental testing company. Those go into a lab, they test them, and they see if those levels of contamination are below or above what would be required by the Environmental Protection Act. So that's pretty much oil tanks in a nutshell. There's something to be concerned about for both buyers and sellers, and you're better off to deal with it earlier in the process rather than later.
So Paul, I guess if people want to get in touch with you to list or buy a home, they can reach you at your website at toffoli.ca, toffoli.ca, or they can give you a call, 604-787-6963. If you want the best real estate agent in Vancouver helping you, this is the guy. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you, Mark.